Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something that, well, affects everyone in Illinois, how much things actually cost. You sent in a great pile of information looking at consumer spending here for 2022, 2023, and even some projections for 2024.
That's right. And our job today really is to dig into what these numbers, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BEA, what they're actually telling us. We want to pull out the key takeaways about where your money's going in Illinois, what's driving those costs, and, what it might mean as you try to figure out your own financial picture here.
Exactly. Trying to make sense of all this data without getting totally swamped by it.
Precisely.
So the big question we're asking is, what are the main things to understand about the cost of living in Illinois right now? And what can these recent trends teach us? Okay, so first things first, where are we getting this info? What are the main sources?
Good question. So to get a clear picture, we're mainly leaning on a few key sources. First, there's the BLS Consumer Expenditure Survey, the CES. Now, for Illinois specifically, the most detailed data they publish is actually for the Chicago-Naperville-Elgin metro area, the MSA.
Right, the Chicago Metro, which is, a huge driver of the state's economy.
It absolutely is. So that Chicago data gives us a really strong indicator, especially for urban and suburban households. But, we have to remember it's not a perfect mirror for every single town or rural area across Illinois.
Sure, that makes sense. A good proxy, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. Then we've also got the Bureau of Economic Analysis's personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. Think of that as like the total spending by all households statewide. Goods, services, everything. It gives us that broader Illinois-wide perspective.
Okay.
And finally, we're using the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. That tracks price changes over time for a basket of common goods and services. We look at it for the Midwest region and specifically for the Chicago area, too, to understand, inflation.
Got it. So Chicago household details from the CES, statewide totals from PCE, and inflation context from CPI. Sounds like a good mix. All right, let's rewind to 2022. It feels like yesterday, but financially, that was a pretty wild year, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. 2022 was really defined by that surge in inflation. We saw people spending a lot more in dollar terms nominally, but a huge chunk of that was just things costing more.
So what did that look like at the household level, in the Chicago area, for instance?
Okay, so looking at the BLS data, the average annual spending for households in the Chicago MSA, this is averaged over 2022 and 2023, was $80,264.
80,000. How does that compare nationally?
It's higher. The national average for that same period was about $75,172. And interestingly, average income before taxes was also higher here, about $111,000 in the Chicago area versus roughly $98,000 nationally.
Okay, so bringing in more, but also spending more. Makes sense in a major metro. What were the biggest budget items?
Housing, no surprise, was the biggest slice. It averaged $27,342 a year. That's about 34.1% of their total spending.
And how's that compare?
A little higher than the national average, which was 33.1%. Really shows the cost of housing here. Food was next, a big one too. $10,894 a year, or 13.6% of the budget. Again, a bit higher than the national 12.9%.
And how did that split between, groceries and eating out?
Good question. It broke down to about $6,600. $6,636 on food at home and around $4,258 spent eating out.
Okay. Housing and food, always the big two. What about getting around? Transportation.
Right, transportation. This is where it gets interesting. Spending in the Chicago MSA averaged $10,741. That's 13.4% of the budget.
Okay. And the interesting part?
That's significantly lower than the national average share, which was 16.9%.
Wow. Okay. Lower share on transportation in Chicago. But wait, what kind of transportation?
That's the kicker. Even with that lower share, almost 89%, 88.8% to be exact, that spending was on private vehicles, cars, trucks.
Huh. That is interesting. Lower spending overall, but still super reliant on personal cars. Not maybe what you'd expect with public transit options.
Exactly. It raises questions, right? Maybe commuting patterns, maybe the cost of public transport itself, maybe something else. It's a real difference from the national picture.
Definitely something to chew on.
Yeah.
What else stood out in the Chicago spending?
Well, Chicago area households also tended to spend a bit more than the national average on healthcare. That was 9.2% of their budget versus 8% nationally. Also higher shares for entertainment, apparel, and even education compared to the U.S. averages.
So it seems like across the board, really, costs were higher, spending was higher in the Chicago area for many key things.
Generally, yes, reflecting both higher incomes and likely higher underlying costs for many goods and services.
Okay, so that's the household view from Chicago. How does that scale up to the entire state? What did the statewide PCE numbers show for 2022?
Statewide, total personal consumption expenditures hit $690.8 billion in 2022, a big number.
Huge.
Of that, about $225.8 billion was spent on goods. We can estimate maybe $79 billion of that was durable goods, cars, appliances, things that last, and about $146.8 billion on non-durable goods like food, gas, clothing.
And services.
Services made up the larger chunk, $432.3 billion. And within that, healthcare services were estimated at around $106.8 billion.
Okay, a lot of money flowing through the Illinois economy. Now, you said inflation was the big story in 22. How bad was it, and how much did it eat into that spending?
It had a massive impact. The main national inflation measure, the CPIU, went up by an average of 8.0% for the year. Here in the Midwest, it actually peaked higher than that 9.5% year over year in June 22. Chicago saw a peak of 8.9% that same month.
Oof, nearing double digits.
Yeah, and here's the crucial part. While total national spending looked like it increased by about 9%, the actual amount of goods and services people bought, what economists call real spending, only went up by about 1.0%.
Wow, so almost all that extra spending was just covering higher prices, not buying more stuff.
Exactly. Purchasing power took a serious hit. We saw some crazy price jumps nationally that year. Food away from home up 7.7%. Shelter costs up 7.5%.
Gasoline.
Oh, gasoline. Up a whopping 45.3% on average for the year nationally. It really put the squeeze on budgets.
45%. Yeah, you definitely remember that at the pump. Okay, so that was the tough picture in 2022. Did things start to calm down as we moved into 2023?
Things did begin to moderate, yes. Inflation definitely slowed down, but it didn't disappear. It remained a factor, and you could see spending patterns starting to adjust to these higher price levels. That Chicago MSA average spending figure, the $80,264, that was the average over both 2022 and 2023, so it holds. But nationally, we did see average household spending increase again in 2023, up 5.9% to reach $77,280.
Okay, so spending still climbing nationally, just not maybe as sharply as the year before. How did the categories shift in 23?
Nationally, food spending was up again by 6.9%. Housing rose 4.7%. And transportation saw another increase of 7.1%. But that transportation increase is really interesting when you unpack it.
How so?
Well, spending on actually buying vehicles jumped significantly, up over 23% nationally, but spending on gasoline fell by almost 13%, as those crazy 2022 prices came back down somewhat.
Huh. So people were buying more cars, or maybe more expensive cars, but paying less to fuel them. That's quite a divergence.
It really is. We also saw national healthcare spending rise 5.3%, and a pretty big jump in personal insurance and pensions, up 9.3%.
Okay. And what about the statewide picture for Illinois in 2023, the PCE numbers?
Illinois' total PCE climbed to $732.1 billion in 2023. That's a 6.0% increase from 2022.
Solid growth, but how did it compare nationally?
It was actually slightly below the national PCE growth rate, which was 6.4%. Looking at the breakdown, spending on goods in Illinois rose more slowly, about 2.9% to $232.2 billion. But spending on services jumped almost 8%, 7.9%, reaching $466.4 billion.
Services driving the growth again.
Yeah, and healthcare within that was estimated at around $116.8 billion. The big drivers nationally were healthcare, housing, and utilities, and food services, things like restaurants and hotels. And just like the household data suggested, overall spending on gasoline went down nationally in 23.
Makes sense.
Okay.
And the inflation rate itself, you said it moderated.
Yes, thankfully. The national CPIU average increase for 2023 was 4.1%. Still high, but roughly half of what it was in 2022.
And regionally.
Here in the Midwest, inflation slowed steadily through the year. It started at 6.2% in January and ended at 3.2% in December. Chicago saw a similar path, dropping from 5.4% down to 3.3% over the year.
Okay, so the rate of increase slowed, but prices weren't necessarily falling, right, just rising less quickly.
Exactly, and that's a key point. Even with slow inflation, the real growth in national spending was still pretty muted, only about 1.8%. It shows those higher price levels were still biting.
People were getting used to these sort of new price norms, maybe?
Yeah.
Higher base levels for everything?
That's a good way to put it. We were seeing smaller increases, but on top of already inflated prices from the year before.
What specific prices were still climbing noticeably in 2023? And did anything actually get cheaper?
Well, nationally, eating out continued to get more expensive, up another 7.1%. Shelter costs also kept rising, up 7.5% again. Electricity went up about 5.8%, and one really big one was vehicle insurance. That surged by over 17% nationally.
Wow, 17% on car insurance. That's huge.
It really is. On the other side, though, we did see prices for used cars and trucks finally come down, dropping about 7.1%. And as we mentioned, gasoline prices fell by almost 13% on average.
Okay, so some relief, but pressure still very much there, especially on things like insurance and housing. All right, we've covered the roller coaster of 22 and, let's say, persistent prices of 23. Let's try and peer into the crystal ball a bit. What are we looking at for 2024?
Okay, looking ahead, the overall inflation picture seems to be stabilizing further. In early 2024, the Midwest CPIU has been running around, say, 2.7 to 3.0% year over year. Chicago has been slightly higher, maybe in the 3.0 to 3.4% range. National trends also point towards continued moderation.
That sounds better, certainly better than 8%. What about specific categories here in Illinois? What's the outlook?
Well, housing costs are generally expected to keep pushing upwards. The latest Chicago data from April 24 showed owners' equivalent rent up a pretty significant 6.1% from the year before. So still strong pressure there.
Okay, housing's still a concern.
Food price increases should be much more moderate. We might even see some slight decreases for groceries, food at home. The Midwest Food Index was up only 2.4% year over year in April.
That's a bit of good news. Transportation.
That's always a bit of a wild card, right? Depends heavily on gas prices, which can swing quite a bit. Vehicle prices themselves might be leveling off, but higher interest rates are still making car loans more expensive.
Right, the financing cost and energy, utilities.
Yeah, energy is looking like another area of increase, particularly natural gas. The Midwest Index for natural gas was up almost 22% year over year in April. Electricity increases look more moderate.
Wow, 22% for natural gas. That'll hit heating bills.
Yeah.
And healthcare.
Healthcare costs, unfortunately, the general expectation is they'll continue their steady rise.
So yeah, even with overall inflation cooling, some key essentials, housing, energy, healthcare, are still likely to put a strain on budgets. What about the broader Illinois economy? How does that play into things?
Well, the Illinois economy has been recovering, showing some strengthening, but its growth has generally been maybe a step behind the national average and even some other Midwestern states. We've seen a bit of softness in areas like professional and business services, finance. That could impact different groups of people differently, you know?
Sure. And how are consumers behaving amidst all this? Are people still spending?
National spending growth, the PCE data, it's slowing down, but it's still elevated. It seems people are adjusting to those new price norms we talked about. Spending might actually be a bit more resilient than, say, consumer confidence surveys alone would suggest.
Interesting. What about jobs and wages here?
Illinois unemployment has been hovering around 4.8, 4.9% recently. Nationally, wage growth was pretty decent in 2023. Here in Illinois, average hourly earnings were around $34.22 in early 2024. Also worth noting, the Social Security Cost of Living Adjustment, the COLA, was 3.2% for 2024. That's helpful, but less than the bumps people saw in the previous 2 years.
Right. So bit of a mixed bag economically. Growth is okay, but not stellar. Wages are up, but maybe not keeping pace with all cost increases for everyone. And people are still spending, but maybe consciously. So putting it all together, what kind of ballpark percentage changes are we thinking for spending in Illinois in 2024 versus 2023?
Okay, very roughly, based on these trends, we might project overall expenditures to increase somewhere in the range of, say, 2.5% to 3.5%. Housing could be up maybe 4.0 to 6.0%, given those rent pressures. Food, maybe 2.0 to 3.0%. Transportation, highly variable, as we said. Energy, maybe 3.0 to 7.0%, driven by that natural gas spike. Healthcare, perhaps 4.0 to 5.5%. And things like entertainment, other discretionary spending. Probably a more modest increase, maybe 1.5 to 3.0%, as people prioritize essentials.
Okay, that gives us a sense of the direction. So let's zoom out one last time. Looking across this whole period, 2022 through the 2024 projections, what are the biggest takeaways? How does Illinois stack up?
I think the biggest theme is that sort of inflation whiplash, right? We had the really rapid price hikes in 22, followed by slower increases, but landing us on a much higher overall price level. That's almost certainly put pressure on discretionary spending as the cost of essentials, housing, food, energy takes up more of the budget.
Right, necessities crowding out the wants.
Exactly, and we saw those specific category trends. Housing is consistently a bigger budget share in the Chicago area, and rising shelter costs are a major ongoing story. Food also takes a slightly bigger slice in Chicago than nationally, but transportation takes a smaller share. despite that reliance on cars, which is still a fascinating point.
Yeah, the transportation piece is counterintuitive.
It is. And overall, comparing Illinois, and particularly the Chicago area, to the Midwest or the nation, generally higher incomes, yes, but also higher overall spending levels. But how that money is spent differs more on housing and food here, less on transportation compared to national averages. It reflects the specific economic realities of living in this region.
And the inflation data itself just confirms that story, right? The peak in 22, then the gradual slowdown, but core inflation still hanging around.
Absolutely. If you look at the CPI numbers side by side for the Midwest and Chicago across 22, 23, and early 24, you clearly see that peak, the subsequent moderation in the overall numbers. And for food, energy's been more volatile, even showing some decreases at times. But that core inflation, stripping out food and energy while it's come down, it's still running above where policymakers would ideally like it to be.
Okay, this has been incredibly helpful in understanding the cost landscape here. So, just to wrap it up, what are the absolute key things Illinois residents should take away from this deep dive covering 2022 to now?
I'd say the main points are, 1, costs have gone up significantly, driven by that big inflation wave in 2022. 2, while inflation rate has slowed, the level of prices is generally higher now, this new norm. And 3, for those in the Chicago area especially, expect higher average spending and income compared to the nation, but also face higher costs for key things like housing, though maybe you save a bit on transportation's share of the budget, interestingly enough.
And looking just a little bit further out, beyond 2024, any quick thoughts?
Well, the hope is for continued gradual stabilization of inflation, but that higher price base isn't going anywhere quickly. There's also that lingering question about Illinois' economic growth potentially lagging the national pace, which could affect purchasing power down the road. So, yeah, careful budgeting seems like it will remain the name of the game for many households.
It certainly sounds like it. This provides a really clear, if challenging, picture of the financial realities here in Illinois. And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, the inflation, the shifting costs, the projections, what are those significant adjustments you might need to think about for your own financial planning in the next few years? And maybe more broadly, what questions does all this raise for you about the long-term affordability of living right here in Illinois? Definitely some important things to consider. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.